Hello, everyone. Welcome in. Hi, all. Welcome. Thanks, everyone, for joining in. We'll give it just a few minutes as folks get logged in. In the meantime, you can introduce yourself in the chat. Let us know your connection to FRN, where you're calling in from. And we'll get started in just a few minutes. Hello to the folks joining in. We'll get started in just a few minutes. You can introduce yourself in the chat as we get set up here today. Hello, all. Looks like we have Laura calling in from LaSalle University in Philly. Hello. Omar from Leftover Love, Rescuing Food in Baltimore. Hi, Omar. Thanks so much for joining us. If folks want to continue to introduce themselves in the chat, we'll get started in just a couple minutes. Hi, Susan from Lehigh Valley Food Council. Awesome. So nice to see you all. Sarah from Bucknell University. So many Pennsylvania folks. Hello. It's love to see it. Hi, Maddie from one of our amazing funders, Gerald L. Leonard Foundation. Nice to have you here. We'll get started in just a few minutes. Continue to introduce yourselves in the chat. Hi, Rick and Roberta, another one of our family foundations. Nice to see you. Thanks for joining us. Amazing. Well, I'm going to go ahead and get us started. Continue chiming in the chat. Let us know where you're calling in from. Looks like we have a lot of Pennsylvania folks. I said Maureen from Arizona State University. Hi, Joe, our friends at Farmling Project. Amazing. So we're going to go ahead and get started. Before we dig into the good stuff, I'll share just a couple of housekeeping items with you all. So like I said, continue to introduce yourselves in the chat. We want this to be an engaging conversation. You can always submit your questions via the chat or also the Q&A function, and we'll answer questions a bit throughout the conversation. So don't feel like you need to hold off on them. We'll have them on hand and ready to address as we go throughout the conversation, as well as towards the end of the time here together. And then also the session is being recorded, including the chat, but we cannot see or hear you, but we'll be sure to send out the recording to folks after this conversation. So to officially kick us off, I'm happy to share that this is our first ever completely mapping conversation. Thanks everyone for joining, and for the folks that may have joined our roundtable talks just last week, you heard us a lot of alluding to our mapping work specifically, but this conversation is solely dedicated into a deep dive into our data, the amazing key findings that we've had, and how we're using our mapping data to inform our programs moving forward. So on the call here today, we have a few of the amazing folks. If you've been on one of our webinars before, you've seen us. So I'll go ahead and let those folks introduce themselves. Regina, if you want to kick it off and share a couple words.
Hi, everyone. So thankful for all of you for spending some of your time with us. Time is such a precious resource, and I'm really excited about today's conversation. This is, I think for me, the word that I have is offering, and so I hope that this conversation sparks, a lot of continued enthusiasm and momentum and connection with all of you and beyond. So thanks so much for your time.
Thank you, Regina. I'll also introduce Katie Jones, FRN's Chief Operating Officer.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. I look forward to the conversation.
Thank you, Katie. And we also have Kimmy on the call, who has greatly supported our maps, and she's also providing tech support today. So you can chat Kimmy at the Food Recovery Network if you're having any tech issues, and she can help you out. So before we dig in any deeper, we want to launch a couple of polls just to get a sense of who's in the room. So the first poll that I'll have Kimmy launch is our different types of audiences on the call here today. So if you can share what sort of affiliation you have with FRN, maybe you're a student or alum, a hunger fighting partner, higher ed, so on and so forth. So we'll have that open just for a few more seconds as folks, it looks like some responses coming in. Amazing. All right. Okay, Kimmy, you can go ahead and end the poll and share the results so we can see who's all on the call here today. Looks like we have an awesome spread. A lot of higher ed folks, community supporters. We have a few students and alum on the call, food recovery verified business. Awesome. Thank you all for joining. It's great to see just the variety of folks that are interested in this work. Also, another poll that we wanted to share is how familiar would you say are you with our data-driven mapping work? Like I mentioned, we've mentioned it a few times on our roundtable talks. Maybe you've read something about it for FRN. Yeah, curious just to see where kind of our baseline is with the conversation here today. So I'll leave that open just for a few more seconds. Amazing. Okay, Kimmy, you can go ahead and end it and we can share it. Great. Yeah. Unsurprisingly, yeah, it's a lot of the folks in kind of the 1 to 3 range. Totally makes sense. Hopefully by the end of the conversation, you'll end up at a 4 or a 5. And yeah, thank you all for joining the conversation here today and just digging into the data with us. So with that, we wanted to share some goals for the conversation that we have here today. First of all, of course, we're going to give a overview of our maps, including kind of the history of our maps and where we started when we first launched our strategic framework, FRN 10X in 2020, and then fast forward to now in 2024. We're going to be talking about how our maps, or specifically the data within the maps, and then how that informs our programmatic offerings here at FRN and how we're specifically using them to target our impact in specific communities throughout the US, knowing that we're a national organization, but we really want to focus on what is our local solutions and how we're driving our program into key areas. And then we also want this, again, to be a form of discussion, of conversation, of questions. There's going to be a lot of like just nitty gritty good stuff today. So imagine there's going to be a good amount of questions. So definitely keep those coming in through the chat throughout the conversation, and we'll take pauses throughout to just check in and see how everyone's doing. So with that, I'll turn it over to you, Regina, to start us off with some acknowledgements.
Thanks so much, Cassie. And again, thank you all so much for your time. As was said earlier, this is, while we've been working on this mapping work for a while now, this is the first time that we're having such a public and focused conversation. And so there's a lot that we want to cover with all of you. And as part of the offering, to know that this is also a continuation of what we're going to talk about today. So you'll hear a lot today, and then, beyond, there's much more for us to continue to weave into. Food Recovery Network, we always want to start off with acknowledgements, of which there are many, and knowing that all of us are in different places and spaces at this very moment, how we're feeling, our lived experience, all of those things combined. And so for today, our acknowledgement that we understand that the work that Food Recovery Network is engaged in is to support creating a different system. That right now, we understand that so much of the food insecurity and the economic insecurity is tied to a system of racism. And that's part of what we're having this conversation about today. And so within that acknowledgement, we know that we are headquartered, many of us live on the land of the Piscataway Conoy clan, a modern day tribe. They are still here with us today in the Maryland area, continue to be stewards of our land, our water, our air. And we are very thankful and in acknowledging the Piscataway Conoy. Thinking about these systems of oppression, we understand that a lot of what we're going to talk about today focuses around the racism and structural racism for communities that are Black and Brown. And you will hear that term, Black and Brown communities throughout the conversation. And I know some of us might have heard BIPOC, another term. And so I just wanted everyone to know that those are terms that we're going to say a lot today when we talk about our maps. And that here at Food Recovery Network, we understand that these systems of oppression have targeted Black and Brown communities. And we believe that Black Lives Matter, that we believe that we stand with our Asian community to stop Asian hate. There's a lot of hate right now that targets marginalized groups. And it is up to all of us to, think about how we want our lived experience to support the weakest of us, the marginalized of us, and how does that reflect back on all of us? In the next section, I have this picture of Harriet Tubman, the engineer of the Underground Railroad, and this is ancestor Harriet Tubman on her land in upstate New York, as an elder. So after engineering the Underground Railroad, ancestor Tubman had this land that was a space for healing and food growing and conversation, and continued to think about, how can we support those of us who are marginalized. And this quote from Toni Morrison in the book Beloved, when we think about our maps, our mapping work, with Food Recovery Network, a map is really important, but where are we trying to go? That's the route. And that's what this conversation is about today. We believe at Food Recovery Network that we have a route, we have a method for supporting feeding more people in the communities that have been systematically denied consistent access. And all that to say, again, thank you so much for being part of this conversation, for helping us to clear that route. We need everybody to support this route. So thank you so much. What are we trying to do? For many of you, you're not unfamiliar with Food Recovery Network, but I always just want to, ground us in the bigger vision that we have as we begin to think about that route, how we're going to do this work. We seek to recover surplus food to feed everyone who's experiencing hunger in the United States. We do that in a lot of different ways. And Food Recovery Network, to do that, we believe we have a very we have a role in this bigger vision. And again, that role, we need everybody here. Our network has grown so much since we have put out that vision of recovering surplus food to feed everyone who's hungry. We started out 4,000 people. We want to grow that to 40,000 people. And today we're at about 6,000 people, all within the network, doing what they can literally every single day to feed more people faster. And I always want to shout out, historically, we were started by college students, we were started by young people, and we continue to be the reverberations of young people, continues to help us be the organization that we are. So for any, student leaders that are on this call today, I just wanted to say thank you to those of you who help by ensuring your surplus food goes to people who need it. Thank you. And to those of you who are on the front lines, helping the underserved get served, helping people who are underemployed, unhoused, any of those groups, thank you so much for everything that you do. We see you, we honor you, and please take this as a moment of the recognition that you so deserve. Again, to continue the framing before I pass things over to Katie, I just wanted to situate us all where Food Recovery Network, within the food supply chain, where we do our work. And so we are all the way from production, the processing, the distribution, the retail, and the consumption. That's, we are all within that. There are opportunities for food recovery all throughout the supply chain as we think about how can we stop that food from going into landfill and creating other routes, other pathways for that food. So we are, farm fields, higher education, large scale events, corporate events, corporate dining, restaurants, the distribution, bringing food from point A to point B. These are all places where Food Recovery Network is. That's where we are to ensure that food doesn't go to waste and goes to those of us who need it most. And you will be hearing from Katie. I'm going to turn things over to Katie to talk about this idea, this concept of who needs this food. And so I wanted to quickly give a moment to, Katie and to Kimmy. I know Cassie did this earlier today, but this conversation would not be possible without the brain power of Katie and Kimmy to put this all together as an offering for all of us to have something tangible that we can think through in terms of how Food Recovery Network can feed more people faster. Again, it's going to be a lot of information, but Katie, please take it away. And we're so excited to hear from you. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much. And again, shout out. I'm going to get into this in more detail, but truly we have been able to bring the conclusions and the research to another level because we have Kimmy on the team. So while this has been really my cornerstone project since I came to FRN 4 years ago, Kimmy, Cassie, and Regina have all been integral in actually making it happen. So again, shout out to all of them, all of you. So we keep on talking about our framework, our framework, our framework. This, what you see in front of us, is our framework. And just to take a step back, one of the things that I was lucky to have the experience to do before I came to FRN was to be an Annie E. Casey Results Count Fellow. Annie E. Casey is a foundation out of Baltimore, and one of the programs that they offer is a results count methodology program. And the hypothesis behind the program is this: regardless of the issue area in which you work for a nonprofit, so whether it's food, whether it's housing, whether it's social justice, it is your job as a nonprofit to close racial and ethnic disparities in your work. And there is a dedicated, methodical way that you can do that regardless of your issue area. And that is the methodology that all of this is based on. And where it all originates from, so wonderful, thank you with the quote from beloved Regina, is it's about the root. Where are we going? So all of this originates with what is the result that we want to achieve in the world, knowing that we are not solely responsible for that result, but we believe we have a unique contribution through the mobilization of college students to help move that result along. And from there, you look at what data is available that helps guide you to see the progress that you're making on the results. So for us at FRN, because we are working specifically around college students, we specifically picked the 18 million tons of excess food waste in commercial and institutional settings. That's data is provided by ReFed. And then we also looked at, again, like what is keeping people in these food pantry lines. It's functionally, for us at FRN, economic security and the lack thereof, which is why 44 million people are food insecure. Now, I will say that if we said recover surplus food to reduce climate change by 20%, these indicators would be different. The way that we would actualize this framework would be different. But because this is our result, this informs everything in terms of the funders that we work with, the type of programming we offer our students, because everything is geared toward this result. And how we pursue that result is by isolating specifically what are the factors that we can influence as FRN, and how do we do that? So that's what you see laid out here in the strategies. First one being that we mobilize our college students. that is absolutely the cornerstone of our work, and nothing would happen without the passion and the dedication of our 6,000 person student network. The second is using this data, how do we target where we deploy both FRN national staff as well as our students? And then the third is really around education, awareness, and advocacy, and how we address some of those structural issues that Regina raised at the beginning. So again, we can see how we can impact a larger scale of people. What's most interesting really about this is, since I've been at FRN for 4 years, the economic security has been the biggest indicator that's gone up and down. And that really has to do with federal policies that have moved people either above or below the poverty line. So again, the advocacy piece is critical here because it's actually federal policy which can make the largest changes the quickest to help bring more people out of poverty, which is why strategy 3 is so vital. And what these strategies also do is they help weed out everything we're not going to work on. So if it isn't data driven, if it doesn't involve students, if it doesn't have a structural element, we're just not going to work on it. And that has created a level of clarity for us in terms of how we operate that has really paid off, not because it's FRN 10X, but paid off more than tenfold. So on the next slide, you'll actually see the changes that you can see in our results since we got this framework in place. So not only have we recovered significantly more food because we have expanded where we recover across the food chain, but we've also mobilized more stakeholders because we can be more specific in who we want to partner with because we know what we're trying to do and what we have and what we don't. And ultimately, that's really what the maps are about. It's about, we had a particular vision, and now I'll get into the nitty gritty of how we partnered with various people to help bring us along. But all of that has led us to the results that you see in this next slide, which is, 16.3 million pounds recovered, 13.6 million meals, which is pretty incredible. And again, most of that poundage has been since we have instituted the framework. So with all of that context, let's talk about the maps. And FRN has always been a national organization with a local solution. So we have a framework, technical assistance, a level of offerings that we can deploy across the United States. And what you see here is actually the very first map we ever did, and what I'll ultimately take you through on the right-hand side at the end of this. But we started with kind of this very general idea of, okay, if we can figure out where the supply is, so where there is the most surplus amount of food, and where the demand is, so where there are the most number of people experiencing hunger, and where our chapters are or are not, then we can put our model in the space of supply, demand, infrastructure, and we can feed more people faster. That's the hypothesis. And that's what you really see on the first map on your left, where we selected 10 states where had large supply, large demand, infrastructure of universities, as well as large race and ethnicity disparities in terms of food access. So you can see largely the Deep South, Texas, California, Ohio, Pennsylvania, which again, like kind of makes sense, right? These are some of the larger states with a lot of infrastructure in terms of higher education. So that's where we started. And what you'll see on the next slide is really the first version of the maps that was done internally 2020. And what this really showed was the data, like the top line data provided by EPA of where the total food waste was. And then it also looked, so that was the supply. And then the demand was using the Feeding America data of where there was food insecurity of more than 20%, which is a tremendous amount. And then it only pulled FRN chapters. So this was what we originally started with in terms of how to focus our efforts. So clearly we were like, okay, great, like Philadelphia is where we should start. And what was interesting is we started having these conversations where I'd show various people maps. And I remember I had one with an organization, Arkansas, and we were looking at the map together, and there was a group of really deep purple shading, and they were like, oh, yeah, like that's all the onion farms. So it was really helpful for people who knew the state to literally give context to the color that we were seeing on our maps. But also, what those conversations did was ultimately connect us to the EPA, and they signed up for the webinar today. I don't know if they're on, but if you are, representatives from the EPA, thank you so much for reaching out. Because basically, what they said to us is, this is great. We're so happy you're using the data. We're so happy that you're promoting that the government actually has this available. However, there's better data, right? And they have this very detailed county level data set where you can actually segment the types of food waste. So while we were using the top line, we could actually get more specific to where specifically FRN targets our work with commercial and institutional settings. And we said, that's great. We do not have the expertise for that. We literally do not have, I don't know if people still use SPSS, but whatever the new version of that is, we don't have it. So this is a really great example of how we went looking for a partner with the idea of what we could do or what we wanted to do, but we didn't necessarily have the expertise. So we were very thankful to partner with the Institute on the Environment at the University of Minnesota, who helped pull in that really robust, more detailed data that FRN literally did not have the infrastructure for. What they also provided was subject matter expertise. So in the sense of we were able to pull the data about where the food waste was, but then the Institute of the Environment was able to say, hey, well, NFRD actually has this research, so it's actually probably only 20% of this number that's actually edible. And so we were able to get a far clearer picture, and more specifically about where we could work. And so this is what you see on this slide is the partnership with the University of Minnesota. So now we had the EPA's data on a county level about where there is the most food waste in commercial and industrial settings, because again, with us focusing on colleges and also large scale events and those sorts of things, that is far more, that is our wheelhouse more than, compost or anything like that. So now that we had more interesting data, more detailed data on the supply side, it also made us think harder about what is the demand side. We had been using the Feeding America data with a very high threshold, but this looks a lot of different ways, and there's a lot of different ways to qualify need. And so that's what you see on the slide is functionally all of the different indicators that we use to help quantify need, because poverty is very specific. SNAP is very specific. But how do we actually look at something more holistic than the very specific measurements? And so this is where, again, we sought to partner with the Massachusetts Institute of Technology Living Wage Center, where their research is completely about what it actually takes for a person to live in a particular zip code. So when you think about food access, transportation, healthcare, childcare, what is it costs to live in a particular zip code? And then also now with the census data, what is the median income? And that was a huge factor for us in illuminating just how big the need actually is. So when you see on this next slide, that the majority of the counties in the United States, people do not make enough money to live there. And this is specifically through the combination of the median income from the census and the living wage data. So put differently, there are only 22 counties in the United States where people earn enough money to live there comfortably. One of the things that I found most interesting when looking at this data is 8 out of those 22 counties are in the Washington, D.C. region, where lawmakers spend a lot of time. So isn't it interesting that where lawmakers are spending a lot of time, there is ample resources? I wonder why that could be. And aside from that, and then again, advocacy tie-in, what it shows us is the need is so much bigger than we think it is. So that really helped us in terms of prioritizing where we want to work, because not only do we have very tangible SNAP, poverty, et cetera, but now we also had a range of how big the gap was between living and median income to help us prioritize where to work within states.
Katie, can
Now,
I chime in for a second?
Oh yeah, of course.
I just wanted to, and we've done this before when we've, talked about this understanding of what it actually takes to live in the United States and who is able to do that comfortably. I worked in the anti-poverty space for a very long time, and I still believe that, FRN is within that anti-poverty space. That when we think about COVID and the absolute disruption that COVID had on everyone's life, when we were seeing people who were comfortable actually also in lines for 4 hours trying to get food on Monday and going to another line on Wednesday, there was just so many people, 54 million people, that we must begin to tell a different story about who is struggling and why we're struggling. That the idea is, it's not people who don't want to work. Most people, our unemployment rate in the United States right now is at historic lows. People want to work. It is a human thing, we have to stop believing that narrative that, people are without because of individual decisions that they've made. The system has stolen a lot from us in terms of our labor and our contributions. It has valued these contributions at very low levels. And here we are today. And, again, part of this offering that we have is to power all of you with more information and tools about what we can do to build a system that supports all of us in thriving. So I just wanted to say that because I think this is, it's such a, hard thing to see. This is difficult. This is us. This is us. We're working damn hard. So what is happening here? And so Katie will continue to tell us.
Thank you. And then I'll also say I'm going to get through this next slide, and then we'll pause for questions, commentary from all of you too. As I mentioned before, this whole methodology is based on closing race and ethnic disparities in your work. And so we have the supply, we have a lot of different ways to look at demand. So then we also layered on the census data of race and ethnicity, because we also know through many, 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 many years of very thoughtful, deep research that communities of color are disproportionately impacted by policy decisions than other communities. So what you see in front of you here is that these are the communities that are predominantly communities of color across the United States. So obviously there are Black and Brown people in every community, but there are only 289 counties in the United States where they are the predominant race. And so that becomes super important when we're looking at where we want to deploy, because we also know, again, through lots of research, that redlining, that climate change disproportionately cuts off communities of color. So that has to be a factor in where we're looking to mobilize. And we can say through some of this work that we have been doing throughout that year, like that routine disinvestment is evident. And it makes the work that much more important, but also that much longer when you're partnering genuinely with communities and not wanting to be extractive in the work. So this is a very important dimension, again, to how we prioritize where we're going to work. So let me stop there for initial questions before I get into kind of what we learned, what it means, what we'll do differently.
Thank you, Katie. We did get a question in asking about SNAP specifically. So Tom writes, I understand that a lot of food insecure people are not eligible for SNAP. Would you think that is a measure worth noting? They would be limited to pantries, food banks, etc. for food support, which is the population FRN donations can reach directly.
So what I would say with SNAP, which is what was super interesting about it, is yes, like there is a particular population, but I would also say what I would say looking from the data is the way that counties make SNAP available, or the way that it's actually promoted as an option, varies greatly across the country. So it is interesting that you will see a very low median income in particular counties, like in the Deep South, but SNAP rates are also very low. And one interpretation of why that could be is because SNAP isn't actually that all easy to access in those particular areas, even though there is demonstrated need. So yes, like the SNAP is important, but again, this gets to like the structural racism pieces of why SNAP is not a complete picture of the need. Regina, what were you going to say?
Yeah, one contribution to what Katie said, and I think it's really important. Two things. I had a really wonderful conversation 2 years now with Emily Broadleaf, director of the Harvard Food Law and Policy Clinic, talking about SNAP and other WIC, other benefits, state or federal benefits, and how they're deployed, to use that word again, and the varying ranges of how long am I eligible for this thing compared to this other thing, the application access, all those things that Katie said. So I just wanted to highlight, a partner of ours in a conversation that we've had. So this again is ongoing conversation. The other contribution to what Katie said that I wanted to highlight is that another part of the narrative that must change of Bill Clinton and the 90s folks that created this concept of the welfare queen. It's a very racialized trope that doesn't exist truly, is that a lot of people who are eligible for SNAP know that they are eligible and are not seeking SNAP because they don't want it, because they want to work, because they want to get the things that they need for themselves and their families through other means. They do not want a quote unquote handout, even though this is a benefit. It's very different than a handout. And so I think that also must be infused into this. People are eligible for benefits and they say, I'm going to do this on my own. I don't want to be a burden.
Thank you both. There was also some other commentary about stuff in the chats as well. I believe that's all the primary questions. So let's keep it moving, Katie, with what we learned and
Let's
forward.
keep it moving with what we learned, which is the first biggest takeaway that we have from the data, because again, this is all targeted to how FRN can have greater impact in a shorter amount of time. So what we learned when we were looking at the data was it was actually community colleges rather than four-year institutions who were most often in those communities with large supply and large demand. So on the next slide, you can actually see a version of the map where the breakout between 4-year and 2-year institutions. And you'll see a little bit more as I get more specific into these maps. But that was a huge takeaway. But again, it gets to this idea of where are 4-year universities? They tend to be in more resourced areas. Why are they in more resourced areas? Because there were more people who were eligible to attend at a particular time in history. So that was a really big deal for us because we had traditionally mobilized in 4-year universities. And what the data told us is there's actually a very large opportunity within community colleges. The second thing that we thought about when we were looking at the data was, again, like, where is the greatest opportunity for FRN? And there was different ways that you could look at that. One was about the total number of schools that were in an area, which is why originally when we picked 10 states, California, Texas, Pennsylvania rose up to the top, because there's just like a larger denominator for success there. But what was interesting is when we looked more at the maps, where those institutions were and where the need was not evenly distributed. So the next slide is a really great example of this. So on the right, you see Texas. And what's super interesting about Texas is that 80% of the higher education is concentrated in 20% of the landmass. So on this slide, you can see that there is a lot of universities around Houston, Austin, Dallas, but where you see the darkest blue is where the most need is, not as many yellow and green dots. So we said, well, we could prioritize Texas and we could have chapters, but we're not actually getting to the other part of our framework, which is the 44 million people who are experiencing hunger. We need the food, but we need it to go where it's most needed. So then that led us to look at smaller schools or smaller states, like Connecticut is an example, where because it's a smaller state, there is more higher ed, more evenly distributed across the landmass. So that in the smaller states provided more of an opportunity for us to get the food where it was most needed, but there was a smaller N or a smaller denominator where we could be successful. So we looked at this both ways, and we basically created a list of two different lists based on how you want to rank them. And what was interesting was that California, New York, Pennsylvania, and Massachusetts showed up in both rankings. So just to be super clear about what those rankings are, it was about where there is the most surplus food generated in commercial and institutional settings. It was where there was the most demand, as looked at by the gap between living and median income, the SNAP rates, poverty rates, and also where there were concentrations of communities of color. And when there is the presence of higher education institutions, anything basically after a high school diploma. And that's how we focused on these rankings and got here. So those are states, but we also know that hunger does not exist equally across all the states. And so much more often it's a region more than it is a particular state. And I've been saying this for years, I'm always like, yeah, let's concentrate, on our top 10 states. And then Regina will be like, what about number 11? And so that's what led us to actually get more specific in terms of our rankings. So we said, okay, like, it's not about states because it doesn't exist equally within a state. It's actually about counties and how we can target and get very specific on a county level. So what you'll see on the next slide is we believe that all states have an opportunity to participate in this work. And if we were to work in any state, these are the counties that we'd start in. And again, this goes back to the framework. This really helps focus our work. So when we get a funding request from a particular region, the first thing we say is it in our target counties? And if it's not, then we think hard and fast before we want to pursue it, because again, like, we need to go where we can have the greatest impact the fastest. And this will also be emailed out, so if people want to see this, they can. Regina, is there anything you want to add there before I get into like how we're using this data?
One, a quick, a thought is, I know we've said it before, but hunger is in every zip code. We are a national organization. We will continue to do everything we can. Our student chapters are coming up, forming all across the United States, and we want more of that. We want more of these incredible people expanding their empathy to others. So I don't want anyone to think like, oh, we're not gonna. This conversation is just to show you, where we can focus our efforts and our contribution to recovering surplus food to feed everyone who's hungry. So
Yeah, and I can give a perfect example for that, if I may. We've been trying to get into Houston for 4 years. Houston said it's the largest food bank in the United States. That is the data that tells us that is the county we should be in. But we have not been able to make success with getting connections in Houston for any variety of reasons. So when we recently were approached by somebody in Dallas and Fort Worth, and they were like, this seems like a super interesting model, would you consider working here? Well, then we went to the data and we were like, well, look at that. Dallas Fort Worth is in the top 3. So we can spin our wheels trying to get into Houston, or we can start working on the third, where we actually have alignment with community partners. And that's what we're pursuing while still trying to get into Houston. So that's a perfect example of like, we're going to work where we can and we're trying to go, but we also have to go where there's opportunity to. But the framework just provides a reference point, so we don't just automatically follow whatever funding we get. We can be really thoughtful about where we work. So how are we thoughtful about the way we work? What you see here, these are those 4 states that showed up across rankings. And throughout this year, we have targeted to try and get as many chapters as we can within these 4 states. Again, with this idea that if we can put our infrastructure to connect supply, demand, and the capacity of students, more food can get back into the community. So, and we're well on our way. Again, we had a goal of, I think, 30 or so new chapters, 50% being within the target states that we are well on our way, if not have already surpassed. And I imagine that as we continue to be more iterative with the data, those chapter outreach efforts are going to get more and more specific. The other thing that I'll say is, as we had mentioned at the beginning, we recover across the food supply chain, which means we do have this model where we can mobilize students, but we also have a model where we recover surplus food from small local farms, and then we host pop-up farmers markets in the areas that our data says food access is most needed. So that is a very specific structure that can really be plugged in anywhere. It's also an interesting structure because this is the first one where FRN National actually goes in and sets up the infrastructure first, and then our students can come and volunteer at those markets. So while we normally have the students setting up the infrastructure while we advise, this is a method where we actually do it first. And it's been really nice for our chapters not to have to do all of that heavy lifting to have this level of community impact. And it's also improved our relationship with those particular chapters and their relationship with more community partners, because they can just show up for a couple hours rather than having to coordinate every aspect of these recoveries. So because this is so targeted, again, our data will tell us where we should have more replication here. And the last, which is really no surprise, is that FRN needs to figure out how to work within community colleges. And it might be a chapter model, but it also might be bringing the pop-up farmers markets to community colleges. One of the things we plan to do in the coming months is to have more intensified outreach with community colleges. So again, because every community college is different. Some have culinary programs, some don't. Some have more consistent students, some don't. We'll be working very intentionally to see how we can expand our network in that way moving forward. So that's the maps in summary. So now, whatever questions you might have, I'd love to hear what you all have to say.
Thank you, Katie. Appreciate it. Digging into the good data and everything. Yeah, if anyone has any additional questions, let's pop them in. I just wanted to add that Maddie commented on the community college piece specifically. This is more of a comment than a question, but smart to include as a strategy because those students often have such strong contacts with their regions and their communities, which I know in my personal experience has been very true as well. I also wanted to bubble up Susan's question, which I love, how nice. How do we as community partners and nonprofit and anti-hunger nonprofits help support your efforts in chapter support and development?
Regina, did you want to take that one?
Yes, struggling with my mouse here. So to unmute me, thank you, Susan, and thank you too for the I think it was Susan about Bill Clinton, Ronald Reagan, or it was Maddie rather. Yes, and you know who has over time fostered this concept. It is about breaking these stereotypes of who needs and who deserves. That's what we are. That's what this whole conversation is about. We all deserve food just because we're here. And so to support, we are looking for our to get chapters. Our best methods over the since 2011 has always been word of mouth. Students self-select. They come on because they care about helping the environment. They want to help their neighbors in need. And we have been able to forge new chapters by working directly with administrators in particular schools, and then getting students to come in afterward from there. So that's huge. If you know of students who have an opportunity, to volunteer, administrators who want to see their surplus food not leaving their campuses and supporting students who are food insecure, those are all really helpful to us in expanding the network. I know this question might not necessarily be, Susan, as nonprofits and anti-hunger. The idea, the concept is the work that we are doing to recover food. It is a very cost-effective solution. It's very cost-effective, and honestly, we really need to reconfigure the system to not throw away food. And where we work, where we're situated is underinvested. We know this from refed. And so the more that we can do to collectively raise funds and raise awareness, that is huge. It's not quite me making a direct appeal because I know our fellow nonprofits are in the same situation. But for those of you who are listening, that you do have different access to funding and to supports, that is another way that we can feed more people faster when we have the financial material means to do the work. And I'll turn it over to Katie because I'm sure you have other contributions to that response too.
The only other thing I'll add, because I know we're running up on time, is advocacy efforts. And I know it can be super hard as a nonprofit or a partner agency to make time for that. But there are so many laws on the books, like even on a state level, about if you can recover prepared food or not. where even just an email to your local representative saying, hey, I think we should change this so we can recover more food and feed more people, just that would be a huge, huge help.
Thank you both. I also wanted to bring up Sarah's comment in the chat, responding that they were not surprised that Philadelphia was a target county in Pennsylvania because of the density of the county, but wondering about rural areas and the work being done in urban and how that can apply to rural. So Katie or Regina, if you have any like kind of comments back to that.
Yeah, I think that there's two things. I went to graduate school in Philly, and one of the things I love most about Philly is I think that they're incredibly innovative. I mean, even recently, I think they started running like a universal basic income pilot around rent. And so part of the issue with like the urban versus rural is about like not just like the awareness of food or the availability of food, but it's also the willingness to look at things differently and having the ability to experiment. And the biggest issue with us mobilizing in rural areas has been largely distance. Like we have tried to put like DoorDash and like do other things to help our students that go to school in more remote communities to make transportation more accessible to them. And DoorDash came to us and they're like, we only do a 10-mile radius. And so some of the issues, again, trying to mobilize more in the rural areas, I think that it's around a lot of advocacy and structural changes that need to happen in order to allow more innovation to happen in those spaces, would be my answer.
Thank you, Katie. And a last question comment was from Joe, which is lovely a transition to what I was going to share. Joe shared thank you. And if you have the opportunity, curious to see how you evaluated different methods and data sets to determine the need with the income, food insecurity, living wage gap, etc. Obviously, a lot of research and would love to hear more. So appreciate that, Joe. And we also wanted to prompt that to the larger group as well. Please share your contact information in the chat if you're curious to chat with us more directly, or if you want some sort of lunch and learn conversation with your network, or perhaps your employees or fellow peers and things like that. We've done a couple of those that are more specifically directed to the given area. So for example, with a company and a lunch and learn, we could do, what do the maps look like in your areas and where your company is based, for example, and kind of digging into the data specifically there. Katie mentioned earlier about, the onion farms. That was like an outcome from one of those types of conversations. So those really help to inform our data and understanding of different states and areas. So please share your contact information in the chat if you're interested in chatting more, whether it's a group or a one-on-one. Definitely happy, and we'll be in touch. So with that, I will turn it over to Katie and Regina for any final just closing thoughts as we wrap up here today.
Yeah, I definitely want the last word to be Katie's. So I'll just say very quickly, another thank you to everyone. For those of you that know Food Recovery Network, and if you know me, I talk a lot about this idea of, there's 44 million people who are food insecure. We waste, billions, of pounds of food. And that can feel overwhelming, but it is truly conversations like this where we can think about what is in the scope of our control in our area. And that's how FRN was founded in 2011, and that's what we continue to do. That when we take small actions, we get one restaurant, one event, our school to begin recovering food one day a week, a couple days a week. Those actions, we turn back around and you look over that course of time, and that is revolution. And we have a route now, right? And I just wanted to thank you all for participating with us, and being with us. We have a lot ahead of us, and so thank you.
And I'll also just add my thanks. Please do be in touch. Really, one of our aspirations for this data is to be able to share it and then inform how other people mobilize within communities and take in different perspectives in terms of how they work. So please do be in touch, and thanks so much for your time today.
Great, thank you, everyone. Appreciate you joining in, and we'll be sure to share our wrap up blog post, recording, and this deck as well with the group. So thank you all for joining. Appreciate your time. Have a good rest of your day.